Hello and welcome to the channel. So today I'm going to be working on a fairly simple woodworking project. I'm going to be making some rustic style coasters that would go underneath a bottle or a glass to help protect the table. Now to do that I'm going to be working with this chunk of wood here. This actually came from a cedar tree that I cut down on my property about 2 years ago. Now this piece of wood may not be 100% dry yet, but I do have a plan for that I'll address later. I'll also mention that when you're working with natural lumber like this, you come into a lot of challenges that you may not see if you're just used to working with dimensional lumber. For example, you can tell here that this piece of wood has a bit of a lean. It's not straight. So if I were to put it on my chop saw, for example, which is designed to cut at a 90-degree angle, I'm not going to get very consistent cuts. And I want these coasters to be fairly consistent. If the angle is too great, then it'll cause the bottle or glass to slide around, and that's not great. So I think that bandsaw would probably be the best tool for that, but I don't have a bandsaw. I do have another solution though, so let me show you that. Okay, so I'm actually going to be using the table saw for this. Now I have the fence set up about a ½ inch away from the blade, which means that as long as I'm pushing the wood up against the fence, it's going to result in nice and consistent ½ inch cuts. Now the only challenge I have with this is that even with the blade all the way in its upward position, it's not quite big enough to cut all the way through this wood. But I do have a solution in mind for that, and I'll show you that after I make the cut on the saw. I'll just be using the saw blade mark here as sort of a guide, and I'll just be finishing this cut up by hand. Now unfortunately my typical wood saw has a bit of a dull blade, so I'm going to be using this. This is really not the best tool for the job, but it's all I have for today. Alright, so I got the coasters sitting above the wood stove. They're going to be there for a few hours just to make sure they're completely dry before I go to the finishing steps. Okay, so the wood rounds here were sitting above my wood stove for just over an hour, and they appear to be completely dry already. One telltale sign are these little cracks that have formed around the edges. This gives me an indication that the wood is completely dry and ready to accept an oil or a stain. But before I do that, I need to dress them up a little bit. You can see there's some burn marks here and there from the table saw blade, and some of them show a bit of a transition from when I went from the table saw to the hand saw blade. Also, there's these jagged edges, so these need to be sanded down, and I'll be using these belt sanders before I move on to the next step. Now I took a couple of scrap pieces of cedar wood and I used different oils and stains to see what I liked best. Now some of them turned out way too dark, like this one here, but this one I think turned out really nice. This is actually boiled linseed oil, and you can really see the wood grain and the cedar, so that's what I'm going to be using on these coasters here. Now believe it or not, these blue paper shop towels actually work really well with oils and stains when you're working with wood, and they don't leave too much lint behind. Okay, so I applied boiled linseed oil to all these coasters here, and they've been sitting in the shop drying for the last few days, and I think they turned out pretty good. Here's what one looks like. If I compare it to a piece of raw cedar that's not been coated, you can kind of see the color difference. You really see the wood grain and the coated one a lot better. Now I was thinking after I got these coated that I probably should have some sort of a base or something to sit the coasters on, and so I went ahead and cut another piece. That's what this piece here is for. So the idea with that is I'll put this on the bottom there, and then these will stack on top of it. I'm thinking about putting 3 rods, a couple on one side, one on the other, just to kind of stabilize these coasters just for storage. And so what I got for rods is I just went out in the yard and picked up some cedar sticks. This came off of my cedar tree. They've been on the ground, so they're actually quite wet. But it's cedar wood, and what I'll do with it next is I'll go ahead and shave off the bark and dry them out really good. And then I'll go ahead and drill some holes into this base piece and put them in there, and then I'll go ahead and coat this in oil as well, and then I'll finish it all up. So first I'm just going to take off these little branches here, snap those off with a pair of pliers. And then for the debarking, this looks like a good job for my trusty Mora knife. Okay, so I have some sticks here that I've debarked and dried on my wood stove. Now I just need to get them into the base. Now I was originally going to do 3 because I don't have a lot of room on this base. It's just slightly bigger than the coasters. But I think I can squeeze in 4, so if I put 2 on this side and 2 on that side, that'll hold the coasters onto the base a little bit better than just having 3. So I'm going to try it that way. So I just need to measure and decide which of these I'm going to use and go ahead and start drilling holes into the base. So this stick here is just a little bit thicker than the other sticks I plan to use, so I'm just shaving it down a little bit with a knife. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up the ends and the ragged edges here of each stick. And I'm going to bevel the end of it. That just helps to strengthen up the ends and protects it from getting cracked. Now I'm just going to sand these down a little bit. I'm not going to bother getting rid of the knife marks. That kind of gives it more of a rustic feel. I'm just going to smooth out the wood a little bit, just with some 320 grit sandpaper. Okay, so it looks something like that. So the next step, I need to glue these posts in place. Once the glue's dry, I'll go ahead and coat the base in some boiled linseed oil as well. Okay, so for the next step with this coaster base here, I'm going to be gluing in these posts. And I decided to use just some standard 5-minute epoxy. This stuff will dry clear. And what I'm doing now is I'm just taking some masking tape and I'm taping up these posts so that I don't accidentally get epoxy up here. It has to be sanded off later. Now one reason for using epoxy is that it helps to fill in the gaps really well. There'll definitely be some gaps here because each one of these little posts is going to be a slightly different diameter. Okay, so after that first coat of epoxy on the bottom of these posts, there were still a couple of really small gaps and a couple of the holes on the top side here. Then on the bottom side, there was a little bit of tear out on a couple of the holes where the drill bit poked through. So I went ahead and backfilled those gaps on both sides with some more epoxy, let it dry, and then I put this on the belt sander so the bottom side's nice and flat now. And I just touched it up with a little bit of hand sanding up on the top side. So this thing is now ready to oil. I'm going to go ahead and put some boiled linseed on it, just like the coasters. Okay, so the boiled linseed oil has had plenty of time to soak into the wood, and everything's now dry to the touch. So now I'm going to start sealing things up. And for that, I'll be using this stuff here. This is spar urethane. Spar urethane is a special type of polyurethane. It's actually designed for outdoor use. So it's highly water resistant. And because drinks are going to be sitting on these coasters here, I thought it would be good to use the extra protection. So that's what I'm doing now. Now this stuff doesn't dry exactly clear. There's a little bit of a tint to it, but I think it's going to turn out pretty nice. Okay, so I applied the spar urethane to each piece here on both the front and back side, and that first coat is now dry. Now it does take quite a long time here in my shop to dry, so it has been a pretty time-consuming process because I coat one side and then once that's dry I flip it and coat the second side. So at any rate, this is what they look like so far with one coat on each side. So I think it needs at least one more coat. This stuff's pretty thick, but this was some really dry wood and it really soaked it in. So I'm going to go ahead and start that second coat now. Okay, so here's the final product. Now I did put 2 coats of the spar urethane on both the front side and the back side of each of the coasters, as well as on the base, and I'm pretty happy with the results. I think everything turned out pretty nice. Now I will say that the center of each of the coasters is a bit glossier than the outside. And that's because that's where the heartwood is, which is a denser wood, and it doesn't absorb the spar urethane as easily as the outside wood does. Now to remedy that, I could add another couple of coats of the spar urethane and make everything nice and glossy, but I decided not to do that, and here's why. My thought is when you have a glass on here, the glossier this coaster is, the more likely it is to easily slide off the coaster. And having the outside here just a little bit rougher than the center may actually help to reduce the chances of that happening. And 2 coats is going to be plenty of coats to protect the wood. So I'm just going to leave this as is. Now another thing I was considering was adding a bottom to each of the coasters, maybe a piece of felt or maybe some corkwood that would be softer and reduce the chances of scratching up a wooden table. But that kind of takes away the rustic look of these. I kind of wanted a simple design, and so I decided after all just to leave them as they are, and I'm calling this project done. Okay, so that's about all I have for this project. I'm pretty happy with the results and the way things turned out. Now, this wasn't a very difficult project to do, but it was pretty time consuming, especially considering I'm doing this in the winter in a cold shop. It took a really long time for everything to dry, but overall it was a pretty fun project, and as always, thank you for watching.